TEDxSoho. What a crazy bucket list moment this is for me. So my name is Samuel Kasumu. I'm going to talk to you about the power of the outsider, and you'll find out towards the end why that is the title of my talk. But I used to work in a place called Number 10 Downing Street, behind that black door. The person I used to work for, the Prime Minister's name is a bit triggering, so I'm not going to say it here, but to give you a clue, he's got scruffy blonde hair and he's currently making loads of money, flying all over the world talking nonsense. So when I was in Downing Street, there were many times when I felt isolated because of my difference. Like on the 25th of May 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, sparking a wave of protests that went all over the globe, including arriving on these shores. Such was the strength of feeling and yearning for justice and equality during that period that hundreds of thousands of people risked their lives in this country in the middle of a pandemic to make their voices heard. Now, during that moment, I felt quite lonely at some points because a lot of my colleagues couldn't quite understand the conflict that I had within me as a youngish black man inside that building, whilst people who shared the same identity as me were outside demanding change. You know, I often asked myself, had I not been in that building during that moment, would I have been outside protesting? There was one particular moment when I left Downing Street and I went home and I switched on my phone in my office, and I saw that there was a eulogy to George Floyd, and there was a guy called the Reverend Al Sharpton who was given this eulogy, and as he began to speak, I began to weep. And I couldn't quite understand what the conflict was that was going on within me. But of course, there was not a lot of time to reflect on that because we were in the middle of a pandemic. Lives were at stake. I had to find the strength to carry on. Now, there were many reasons why I felt like I was an outsider in Downing Street during that period. And it wasn't just because I was the only black advisor for most of that time. I'm also from a working class background, from a single parent home, grew up in social housing, which is not very atypical for any senior advisor, even up until now. I also have autism, which meant that for many times, in fact most of the times, the lens within which I saw the world was very different from a lot of my colleagues. Now, before I carry on, has anyone in the room ever felt like an outsider? Just checking if I'm talking to the right audience. Awesome, good, wonderful. I believe that being an outsider gives you a unique opportunity to drive change in our world. I think that outsiders hold the keys to our future. And so the question is, how can you use your outsiderness to create the future that you want for yourselves and also for others? Now, of course, being an outsider means different things to different people in different moments for different reasons. And so to give you an example of some of the things that I think outsiders bring, I want to cast your minds back to the 22nd of June, 1948. Was anyone born then? No? Okay, fair enough. 22nd of June, 1948. There was a boat, a big boat, huge boat, called the Empire Windrush. Arrives on the docks of Tilbury in Essex, carrying just under 500 Caribbeans who had answered the call from the so-called motherland to come to help rebuild post-war Britain. Now that boat arriving sparked a wave of migration from across the Caribbean and the Commonwealth as they arrived to create a better future and to help to rebuild this country. They weren't treated very well. In fact, many of them were denied accommodation. Many faced physical and verbal attacks on our streets. And this is the conflict that you often have with outsiders who have a clear value that they bring, but face conflict because folks don't necessarily embrace their value. Fast forward to now, and before now, one of the things I was responsible for in Downing Street is trying to right the wrongs of the Windrush scandal. This was a scandal that many of you would have heard of when those same Caribbeans that helped to rebuild post-war Britain found themselves in a position where they were destitute because of bad things that the Home Office had done. They weren't allowed to work, many of them. Many of them were threatened with deportation. Some were forcibly removed, and unfortunately, some have died without ever experiencing justice. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this is one example, but I submit to you that there are countless examples that many of you would have heard of, and in fact, may have been your own stories where, as an outsider, you have had a value that you brought, but that wasn't necessarily recognized. And so when I left Downing Street, I took myself on this journey of discovery to try to truly understand what it means to be an outsider, and I've crafted what I hope to be a blueprint for other outsiders. So on this journey, I came across this fascinating political scientist called Anthony King. And he said that according to him, there are 3 different categories of outsider. The first is your social or demographic outsider. Now this is an outsider that is different from a dominant or majority group for an objective fact. It could be the color of your skin, your gender, the football team you support. I'm a Liverpool fan. Any Liverpool fans in the room? All right, so we're outsiders right now. Right? And so that's the first and obvious type of outsider. The second type of outsider is what Anthony King called your psychological outsider. Now, this is the type of outsider that might look or feel like a majority or dominant group externally, but internally, they feel different. So this could be the quiet sibling within a household, the one that they said was less academic, the introvert. It could be someone that suffers from dysphoria. It could be somebody that has experienced some form of trauma in their lives that nobody knows about. And when a conversation is sparked, for some reason, they feel psychologically unsafe or like an outsider. And this is probably the most common form of outsider that most people do not know exists. And the third type of outsider, and the one that has the most agency, is your tactical outsider. This is somebody that separates themselves from a majority or dominant group in order to seek out some form of advantage or because of their disdain for a particular discourse. An example, of course, is my old boss, there's his name. Boris Johnson, who went to Eton, studied at Oxford, was the editor of The Spectator magazine, had a column at The Telegraph. In many respects, somebody that you could reasonably call an insider. But if you visit any northern town today, you will find citizens there who feel like, for some reason, Boris Johnson is different from the other politicians. Another example is Nigel Farage, somebody who's, of course, another name that's quite triggering, apologies. Somebody who, of course, went to a fee-paying school as well, was a banker, friends with Rupert Murdoch. But if you go to any part of this country, you will know or find people who say that Nigel Farage has separated himself as an anti-establishment outsider. He's the person who led the charge for us to leave the European Union, and of course he is disrupting our political system once again. Another example in America, of course, is Donald Trump. Loads of triggering names today, but don't worry, I'm going to move on shortly. You know, a so-called billionaire, at least according to himself. Fee-paying school, etc., comes from privilege, hails from privilege, but he has been able to inspire folks in so-called Rust Belt states to feel like he is the one that can make America great again and again. So all of these folks, for whatever reason, have chosen to position themselves tactically as outsiders. Now, what brings all of these types of outsiders together, whether you were a social or demographic outsider, psychological outsider, or tactical outsider, in my view on this journey of discovery, I found that what brings them all together is that outsiders are folks who are set apart for a purpose. In other words, you are different for a reason. And it's the ability to identify why you are different that allows you to unlock the power of the outsider. Now, the challenge or the sad thing for us all is that it is those who are often using outsiderness as an opportunity to tactically seek out advantage that recognize just how powerful the value of outsiders are. And so my message to the world, and this message I've been taking to every corner of this country over the last year, is that outsiders have a unique value that they bring. In fact, I would argue that this value is something that people must recognize. And so I've come up with a few things that I believe outsiders can bring. Outsiders can challenge commonly held orthodoxy, essentially meaning that very often if somebody who is different comes into an environment where there is a culture or a way of working or a way of doing things, their fresh perspective can often help to stimulate progress. They can increase productivity. We know that in Great Britain right now we have huge challenges around our output per worker. Outsiders can stand out. They can send a signal. Outsiders are able to heal divisions. We know all across the world, unfortunately, we are hearing and seeing wars and rumors of wars, and actually outsiders are often the ones that can be one step removed and be able to heal divisions. They can broaden audiences, and of course, they can inspire others. So these are some of the things that I think are values that outsiders can bring. Now, I also think that when we get to the point where we're able to essentially reposition how people perceive outsiders, that will allow us to progress as a nation. And for some people, there is a fear around what being an outsider or having outsiders around us could bring to us as a society. And my argument to those people is that actually, if you think about this small island off the coast of continental Europe, and think about how this small island was able to, at one point, command a third of the planet. How this small island continues to be the 6th largest economy in the world. The reality is, the answer is, the secret is, outsiders have come here, have added value, and that is what makes us so special. If you cast our minds back 2,000 years from now, no, not forward, backwards, there you go, 2,000 years backwards, 43 AD, these folks called the Romans came here and they took over these islands. Roman Britannia was a place that was special. It was special because the Romans brought infrastructure, modern agricultural practices in those times. If it wasn't for the Romans, these straight roads that we love wouldn't really be the way they are. Fast forward 400 years to 410 AD, and these Germanic-speaking folks called the Angles and the Saxons arrived on these shores. And they were the ones responsible for how we look at the map that we have today. They divided Britain into 7 kingdoms. You had Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. I don't know if that's 7, folks. But check that out in your own time. But of course, there are two other things that the Anglo-Saxons brought their way. They brought the Christian faith with them, but most importantly, under the Anglo-Saxons, for the first time, England became one kingdom. That was the first time that the term English became a thing. Fast forward to 1066, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror arrives here. They build these lovely castles that we love to go and see. And also, more interestingly, they are responsible for the abolition of slavery. Up until that moment, Brits would enslave themselves, which was something that the Normans thought was barbaric. 600 years after that, of course, Britain became a dominant player in the transatlantic slave trade. And if I had more time, I would talk about the British Empire, the Commonwealth of Nations. I would fast forward past even the Windrush generation until when we joined the European Union and we had a wave of migration from Europe, which helped to establish much of our hospitality sector. Of course, now we have migration still from places like Nigeria and India, who were responsible for propping up our higher education sector, but also dealing with some of the skill shortages we have in our care sector. And so whether we like it or not, Great Britain is great because outsiders have arrived on these shores and added value. In fact, I would argue that outsiders are not just the keys to our past, but they are also the keys to our future. And I know that during this period of heightened tension and anxiety around immigration, that is probably something that is a controversial thing to say. But I kid you not, as somebody that understands policy, that worked for that guy, whichever way you want to cut it, this is a nation that will have to rely on outsiders in order to sustain itself. Now, the last thing I was responsible for whilst I was in Downing Street was the vaccine deployment. So I worked alongside a guy called Nadeem Zahawi, who was the minister at the time, and this was the largest post-war operation since the Second World War, when women and children were ushered to safety. Now, why is it that the Prime Minister at the time felt that myself and Nadeem were the right people to lead in that work? It's because we were different. We understood how to reach groups that your typical advisor or minister simply wouldn't have known how to. We were willing to challenge how things were done in order to make sure that that vaccine got to every single corner of our country. Controversially, we advised the Prime Minister to work even with the opposition, which was something that not everybody was keen for us to do at the time. And these are some of the things that outsiders are able to do. We're able to look at things differently, have a slightly different lens, challenge how things are done, and hopefully drive progress. And so whenever you might feel like you are an outsider, if you are one of a few or the only one in any environment, recognize that there is a reason why you are different. There is a value that your difference is supposed to bring. Whether it's because you look different, feel different, or purposely set yourself apart, recognize that outsiders have the potential to change their world on any stage. Now, this has been a journey of discovery for me. I've learned that outsiders or outsiderness is a universal feeling that so many people have. But if you embrace that feeling, it can truly be a superpower. And that is the power of an outsider. Thank you.